It's definitely fair to say that Max Verstappen is the linchpin in the current driver market, and it's similar to Hamilton going to Ferrari last year. It feels like Max is going to be the first domino before we see any big moves for 2026 or even for 2027. So far there has been talks about him staying at Red Bull, about him leaving Red Bull, and even taking a sabbatical for 2026 ahead of reassessing all of the teams with their brand new power units for 2027. And now, given that Max is the best driver in Formula 1 and the person that seems to be able to get more out of his car than anyone else on the current grid, I think basically 9 out of the 10 teams, with Ferrari being the exception, given that they do have Leclerc and Hamilton locked in for the next couple of years, basically all of them would wait and open their doors and even kick their current drivers out of the team just to have Max Verstappen race for them in 2026. Now, in terms of Max, he himself has been very coy about his future in the media and actually a little bit on the offensive when people have pushed him, because I think from his eyes, all of the attention from him has to be on the performance of the current Red Bull to make sure that he can win the 2025 World Championship. However, we know that last year there was already talks with Toto Wolff. There is endless rumors almost every single month about big money offers from teams like Aston Martin, and even his manager in the background had a very public and very heated discussion with Helmut Marko in Bahrain, which just shows that although on the face Max is trying to just play it cool and not talk too much about his future in the media, behind his back his team is working very hard to make sure that they do their due diligence and make sure that they lay out all of the best options for Max going forward. And now, in fairness to Max, I've already made multiple videos both during the season and even before the season talking about all of his options for 2026 and beyond, and also talking about some of the factors at Red Bull that potentially might sway him to leave the team at the end of the year. So in this video, I want to make it a little bit more about Red Bull themselves, because if Max does decide to leave, which is absolutely a possibility because even Helmut Marko, we know how open he is to the media, sometimes even maybe too often a little bit. He has basically come out and said that if we do not give Max a good enough car, then there is a very good chance that he could leave Red Bull. Red Bull know that there is a very real possibility that Max could leave at the end of the season if they continue to disappoint, and then especially if their brand new Red Bull powertrain in collaboration with Ford in 2026 is also a disappointment, that Max could leave in the next couple of years. That means that this team has got to create contingencies right now for a post-Max Verstappen future, and that has kind of been my criticism about them over the last couple of years. It feels like this team has been so centered around Max that he's kind of at this point the last piece of string holding this team together. If he were to leave, it really does feel like this team would collapse into the midfield, and even just commercially speaking with the sponsors that this team has and just the standing in Formula 1, that would feel like an absolute disaster for Red Bull. They absolutely would need a race-winning and potentially even championship-caliber driver to step into Max's place, and more than anything else, an experienced driver who would have instant authority within the team to be a team leader. Now, that driver, whoever he is either going to be a driver from their own pool, but most likely, it is potentially going to have to be a driver from another team at the moment. Now, before we get to those other drivers, I do think it's only fair to talk about the drivers within the current Red Bull pool, and the problem is that although the likes of Tsunoda, Hadjar and Lawson are really quality midfield drivers, and maybe one day with the right experience, the right team environment, and also the right car at their disposal as well, I think that they could be podium contenders and maybe even race winners. The problem is that none of them have that ceiling, and they're not sustainable for the long term for Red Bull, because I just do not see them as world champions. Someone like Yuki, for example, and I'm a big Yuki fan, I think he has the potential to be a really solid long-term number 2, like a Barrichello to Schumacher, Webber to Vettel, or a Bottas to Hamilton, but I just do not see him being able to supersede Max Verstappen as a potential world champion. He just has not shown that ability over the past couple of years, and even now he is still getting to grips with the car, which is why I think that Red Bull at the moment are kind of locked into looking at other drivers from other teams. The first driver that we have to talk about is George Russell. Now, this has been undoubtedly one of the biggest storylines of 2025 because, once again, I don't think I've said this every single time that I've talked about George Russell, he still doesn't have a contract for 2026. Now, we already know, based off last year, based off what Max and also Toto have said, that they have had some kind of talks in 2024 about potentially linking up in the future, and if that occasion arises and Mercedes do decide to basically abandon George Russell in favor of Max, What about just a simple swap deal with George going to Red Bull and Max going to Mercedes? Now, the really interesting thing about this potential swap deal is that there was already a little bit of bad blood between Max and George and even Toto and Horner, so this would be a complete switch around of alliances, which I just think for the content would be absolutely amazing. Now, recently there has been reports that Russell and Horner did have informal talks about potentially linking up in the future, which doesn't really surprise me because George Russell is still in negotiations for his contract, and even if you're not intending to go to Red Bull, or even if you're not intending to go to any team that you talk to, it is always good to get a lay of the land, which is I think what George Russell is trying to do, and once again just doing your due diligence because you never know what might happen in the future. If this situation were to arise and Toto Wolff and Mercedes succumb to the Verstappen pressure, I think I've talked about before how unbelievably harsh this would be on George Russell. He has such a long history with Mercedes. He has been a Mercedes junior for basically a decade, and in terms of his side of the bargain, he has done everything Mercedes have asked. He has become a race winner, he has become the team leader in the post-Hamilton era, and it's actually Mercedes who have failed to give him a championship level car. And now ultimately all of this can be sorted if Toto Wolff just gave George Russell a long-term contract, and whilst there has been rumours about a 2-year deal, which isn't exactly a very long deal for apparently your number one driver that you trust to win you the World Championship, it just feels like if George was to get kicked out of Mercedes, despite the fact that he is having the best start to his career with 3 podiums in the first 5 races, I think somehow him ending up and landing at Red Bull is almost a best case scenario for both Russell and also Horner and Red Bull. In terms of Red Bull, they would get a, for sure, championship caliber driver and a team leader, a very hot prospect in Formula 1, and arguably one of the best drivers on the grid right now. The only thing that I think might get a little bit difficult about this situation is cultivating that relationship between Russell and the Red Bull hierarchy, because how George Russell is going to work with Horner and Helmut Marko more than anyone else, that will be very, very interesting to follow, because to me that is just a total clash of characters. But once again, when alliances form and when you need a quality driver and when Red Bull are potentially giving you a race-winning car when you've been dropped by Mercedes, sometimes beggars just can't be choosers for George Russell. The next driver on my list who I think Red Bull absolutely should consider in case Max decides to leave is actually Lando Norris. Now, I find it really surprising that despite the fact that Piastri has just extended his contract and signed a long-term deal until 2028, Lando's contract still expires at the end of 2026. That makes the timelines a little bit easier, and maybe if there is room to negotiate for Red Bull and they do feel that Lando is the driver they want and Lando wants to go there, I am sure they can make it happen for next season. And now this is a really interesting one because I think it all depends on how Lando feels inside of McLaren and whether this team is starting to slowly gravitate towards Oscar. We know that Lando really needs to have the team around him, and we also know that Red Bull have also made advances towards him in the past. In 2023, there was talks between Horner and Norris about him potentially coming to the team, but then at the beginning of 2024 when Lando was pushed on it, he said that he would not be able to compete at Red Bull because the team is too much around Max. The beginning of this season has been a bit of a mixed bag for Lando because whilst he has had a relatively good start to the season, he is undoubtedly a title contender, and yes, he's had a few bad races, but there is still a long way to go in this season. There is still a long way to go for him to improve and win this championship, maybe even comfortably ahead of Oscar and Max. It also just does feel a little bit like he's starting to lose his grip on McLaren, and that could open the doors for a potential move to Red Bull. He is a race-winning driver, there is no doubt about it. I do think he has the potential to be a world champion, and maybe at Red Bull with that kind of support system, a management that definitely has had interest in him in the past, and also with a number 2 driver like a Yuki Tsunoda by his side. I just think that that combination has a lot of potential, and even from a commercial aspect, I think given all of Lando's interests and businesses outside of Formula 1, something about the Lando Norris and Red Bull brand I think would just click a lot better, for example, than say a George Russell and Red Bull combination. And now, as things stand, even though Zach has not given Lando a long-term contract yet, there is not really a need for Lando to leave McLaren, especially since they have the fastest car on the grid. But there definitely could become a situation like a Verstappen-Ricciardo type at Red Bull in 2018. where the younger driver who has just come in just starts to gravitate the entire team around him, and the incumbent and older driver starts to potentially feel left out emotionally. If that situation arises, that is where I think Red Bull could potentially swoop in to get Lando Norris. And there is also the even more dangerous situation of, what about if Max Verstappen comes to Zak Brown and wants to be a McLaren driver? In that situation, I do not see how Zak can say no to Max Verstappen driving for McLaren, and if it is a choice between Oscar and Lando, there is a very good reason why Oscar is the only one with a long-term contract at the moment. Last up, let's talk about Arvid Lindblad. He is by far the biggest Red Bull talent in the lower formulas at just 17 years old, currently racing in Formula 2, and he would definitely be an Antonelli kind of situation. And now he already has the super license points based off the races and championships that he has won to race in Formula 1 in 2026, but for sure he would be a more long-term prospect to replace Verstappen. I think that he could go into Formula 1 in 26 and race at Racing Bulls for a year, and if they train him up right and do the right preparation for him to also race then for Red Bull, he could potentially then be the future replacement for Verstappen at Red Bull in 2027. And now, that is a hell of a lot of pressure for a 17-18-year-old next year, but if you want to know more in depth in terms of why this guy is so special and why he could be Red Bull's next Max Verstappen, then I thoroughly recommend checking out the video that I made on him in depth a couple of weeks ago that will go into a lot more detail. The fact is that he has the potential to be a future world champion, and if Red Bull potentially want to use him as a Verstappen mold just as they did promoting Max after his first year, I could definitely see Max wanting to leave at the end of 26 if the engine program isn't quite what it seemed, and it opens up the door for Lindblad to take over Red Bull and potentially become their next championship winning driver. With Arvid Lindblad, it is all about the preparation, the planning, and then the testing to integrate him into the Red Bull team to make sure that he hits the ground running. We also don't know in the post-Verstappen era what the car's characteristics are going to be like, because when there are different drivers dictating the development of the car, is it going to make it easier for perhaps a younger driver to step in, and is it even maybe going to raise the ceiling of the second driver as well, even if the peaks without Max are not potentially going to be that of challenging for the championship every single season? These are the problems that Red Bull are going to have to contend with when Max eventually decides to leave Red Bull, and they have to start making contingencies for a post-Verstappen Red Bull, because there is a very real possibility that he could leave at the end of 26, or maybe even at the end of this season. Well, there you have it. If you did enjoy this video, then don't forget to subscribe. That would be massively appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.